Today, we will tell the story of a woman whose name became the embodiment of fear, curse, and terror. When we hear the name Medusa, a creature with snakes for hair, appears before our eyes, a gaze that turns all living things to stone. Her name is a symbol of a monster, and her appearance a symbol of death. But few remember that Medusa was not always a monster. She was a mortal woman of rare beauty, pure, devoted, and serving the goddess Athena. She was not born a child of darkness. She was made into one. Betrayed by those she served, insulted and punished for the sins of others, Medusa became a symbol of injustice that comes not from humans, but from the gods themselves. Her transformation is not just a myth about punishment. It is the story of a soul broken by the immortal and of a woman forced to become a monster in order to survive. Before she became a monster, before her name became a symbol of terror, Medusa was simply a young woman of extraordinary beauty. She was born in a small coastal town where the Aegean Sea touched the sandy shores and whitewashed houses climbed the olive-covered hills. Life there was simple. Men went to sea to fish or trade with passing merchants, while women wove cloth, tended their homes, and offered prayers to the gods. Everything followed the rhythm of the sun, the wind, and the tides, and in that rhythm, even ordinary life felt sacred. Medusa grew up in a home filled with the scent of warm bread and olive oil, where her mother lit a lamp before the image of Athena each morning, and her father told stories of heroes and miracles. She was mortal, and that single truth would one day seal her fate. Unlike her immortal sisters, Stheno and Euryale, Medusa was born as human as any other child, destined to know both the joys and the sorrows of mortal life. From an early age, there was something about her that defied explanation. Her hair, thick, radiant, and alive with light, shimmered like gold or burnished copper, depending on the hour of the day. Her eyes were deep and alive, like the sea itself. Even the elders of her town, who had seen many wonders, would say they had never beheld such beauty. Not in Athens, not even in Crete. As Medusa grew into womanhood, tales of her beauty spread far beyond her seaside home. Young warriors and poets returning from their travels spoke of her as though she were a vision touched by divinity. But Medusa, raised in modesty and faith, felt unease in such attention. She did not wish to be adored or pursued, not for something as fleeting and unearned as beauty. Seeking peace, she left her home for Athens, the city of light, stone, and wisdom. There stood the great temple of Athena Parthenos, a sanctuary of marble and silence. Medusa took her vows before the goddess, a life of purity, devotion, and service. The days of a priestess were austere, yet filled with meaning. Morning hymns, the sweeping of the temple floor, the reading of ancient hymns and sacred texts. In these rituals, she found comfort. Among the other maidens, she discovered companionship and purpose. Within those marble walls, her beauty mattered less than her faith, her mind, and her heart. But Medusa made one fatal mistake. She believed that in the service of a goddess, she would be safe from the whims of gods. She did not yet know that even wisdom could not shield her from divine envy, desire, or wrath. In a world where gods walked among mortals, protection was never certain, and the greatest danger often came not from the shadows below, but from the heavens above. Poseidon, god of the seas, earthquakes, and horses, was not accustomed to being denied anything he desired. He was one of the three great brothers who had divided the cosmos among themselves. Zeus took the sky, Hades the underworld, and Poseidon the vast oceans. He was powerful, temperamental, and utterly convinced of his right to claim whatever caught his eye. And Medusa had caught his eye. He first saw her walking to the temple in the early morning light, her priestess robes flowing around her like water, her famous hair braided and pinned in the modest style befitting her sacred duties. He watched her performing rituals by the shore, offering prayers to the gods with her head bowed and her voice raised in song. He had heard the tales of her beauty and decided he must see for himself if they were true. But once he saw her, admiration turned into obsession. Poseidon appeared before her in his divine form, radiant and commanding, his eyes like the depths of the sea, his presence as overwhelming as a storm. He spoke to her of his desire, as if his longing alone were reason enough, as if her own wishes mattered less than the will of a god. But Medusa refused him. She was a mortal woman, standing alone before one of the most powerful beings in existence. He could have shattered the earth beneath her feet, raised the sea to swallow her city. But she did not yield. Fragile, mortal, and trembling, she lifted her head and said softly, "No, I am a priestess of Athena," she said, her voice steady despite her fear. She had sworn vows of devotion and purity, sacred promises that bound her to her goddess. To break them would be to betray Athena, her temple, and herself. She pleaded not as one begging for mercy, but as someone whose faith was stronger than her fear. She asked him to honor her goddess, to respect the sanctuary, and to leave her in peace. Poseidon listened, and irritation grew in his heart. He was a god unaccustomed to defiance. A mortal woman had dared to reject him. Her courage, instead of inspiring respect, wounded his pride. Her loyalty to Athena, his rival, burned in him like salt in an open wound. And so, his obsession deepened, transforming from desire into a test of power, a challenge between divinity and mortal will. There are many versions of what happened next. Some say he followed her into the temple when the sun hung low, the shadows stretching long across the marble floor. Others say he found her later, alone and unguarded, when silence filled the halls and the only sound was her soft prayer echoing through the sanctuary. The stories differ in detail, but they all share one truth. Poseidon defied her will and desecrated the sanctity of the temple. What followed was not an act of love, but an act of domination, an unforgivable affront to both her vows and the holy place she served. When it was over, Poseidon departed, returning to the depths of the sea as if nothing had happened. For him, it was a fleeting moment. For her, it changed everything. Medusa lay on the temple floor, her world shattered. Her faith, once unshakable, now felt like sand slipping through her fingers. She wept, not only for herself, but for the innocence and trust that had been taken from her. She cried for the silence of the gods, for the emptiness that replaced her prayers. But most of all, she wept because she knew deep within her soul that this was not the end. It was only the beginning. A greater cruelty awaited her, not from Poseidon, who had already turned away, but from the very goddess to whom she had devoted her life. From Athena, the one she had worshipped, trusted, and served. The goddess who should have protected her, but instead would turn against her. When Athena discovered what had happened in her temple, she was furious. Her sacred space had been violated, her authority challenged, the sanctity of her domain defiled. A line had been crossed, and someone would pay for this transgression. But here is where the story takes its cruelest turn, where divine logic reveals itself as fundamentally unjust. Athena did not punish Poseidon. How could she? He was her uncle, one of the great Olympians, a god whose power nearly matched her own. To challenge him would mean divine conflict, would require calling upon Zeus for judgment, would involve politics and alliances and consequences that might ripple through Olympus for centuries. It was complicated, messy, and politically dangerous. Punishing Medusa, on the other hand, was simple. Never mind that Medusa was the victim. Never mind that she had refused Poseidon, that she had fought against him, that she had been devoted to Athena and faithful to her vows. Never mind that she was mortal and powerless and had already suffered more than any person should have to endure. None of that mattered when weighed against the convenience of divine anger, needing an outlet and finding one that couldn't fight back. Some say Athena was jealous, that Medusa's beauty had always rankled, that the goddess of wisdom couldn't stand to be outshone in her own temple by a mere mortal. Others claim Athena saw Medusa as complicit, that in her twisted logic, the priestess must have somehow invited Poseidon's attention, must have been less than devoted to her vows, must have been to blame for her own wronging. Still others suggest that Athena was punishing not the act itself, but the defilement of her temple, making Medusa a scapegoat for Poseidon's crime because the god himself was beyond her reach. Whatever the reason, and perhaps there was no reason beyond cruel caprice, Athena's punishment was absolute and terrible. She cursed Medusa. The transformation began with pain. Medusa felt it starting in her scalp, a burning, itching sensation that quickly became unbearable. She reached up to her famous hair, and her fingers found not soft curls but something else, something that moved, that writhed, that hissed. Her hair, her beautiful hair that had been the least important part of her beauty but the most commented upon, was transforming into serpents, living snakes, each one venomous, each one a separate entity with its own malevolent intelligence, all growing from her skull where hair should be. But the snakes were only the beginning. Her skin began to change, taking on a greenish tinge, scales appearing in patches that spread and merged. Her hands twisted into claws, her fingernails becoming talons. Her beautiful eyes, those expressive, soulful eyes that had drawn so many admirers, were transformed into something else entirely. Now, anyone who met her gaze directly would be turned instantly to stone, their flesh and bone transmuted into cold marble, a permanent monument to the moment they saw her. The most famous part of the curse, the petrifying gaze, was perhaps the cruelest aspect of all. It meant that Medusa could never again look directly at another person without killing them. She could never meet anyone's eyes, never see another human face, never have a normal interaction. Her very existence became a danger to anyone who came near her. She was transformed from victim to threat, from the pursued to the pursuer, from a young woman who had sought only peace into a monster that people would hunt. When the transformation was complete, Medusa looked at her reflection in a pool of water, carefully, afraid of what she would see, knowing already that everything had changed. The monster that stared back at her was a grotesque parody of the woman she had been. She wept, but even her tears were bitter poison now, and where they fell, the ground itself withered and died. Her sister priestesses, when they discovered what had happened, fled in terror. The temple that had been her sanctuary became a prison, and then even that was denied her. She had to leave, had to flee civilization entirely, for she was no longer welcome anywhere humans dwelt. Every person she encountered either turned to stone from her gaze or fled, screaming in terror from her appearance. Medusa's sisters, Stheno and Euryale, the immortal Gorgons, found her eventually. They had always been monsters, born that way, and they welcomed their transformed sister into their fold. Together, the three Gorgons retreated to the far edges of the world, to a desolate land where few travellers ventured and fewer still returned from. They made their home in a cave on an island in the Western Ocean, surrounded by the petrified remains of those who had sought them out, heroes looking for glory, warriors testing their courage, or simply unfortunate sailors blown off course by storms. But while Stheno and Euryale were monsters by nature, content with their existence, Medusa remained a woman transformed against her will. She grieved for her lost humanity, for the future that had been stolen from her, for the injustice of it all. She had been wronged twice, first by Poseidon, then by Athena, and both times she had been powerless to defend herself, her own wishes and welfare utterly irrelevant to the gods who shaped her fate. The years passed, though time meant little to Medusa now. In her cave on the edge of the world, surrounded by her sister Gorgons and the stone statues of the dead, she existed in a state that was neither living nor dying. She could not age, could not die naturally, but neither could she truly live. She was trapped in the moment of her transformation, forever cursed, forever suffering. The cave was dark and damp, lit only by the occasional torch, or the phosphorescent glow of strange fungi that grew in the deepest recesses. The air was thick with the smell of salt and decay, and the sound of waves crashing against the rocks outside provided a constant melancholy soundtrack to her existence. The floor was littered with bones and abandoned weapons, the remnants of those who had come seeking the Gorgons and found death instead. But the worst part, the truly unbearable part, was the loneliness. Medusa could speak with her sisters, and they were kind to her in their way, but they could not truly understand. They had always been monsters, had never known what it was to be human, to love and be loved, to have dreams and hopes and a future. They did not grieve for what they had lost because they had never had it to begin with. Medusa, however, remembered everything. She remembered the feeling of sun on her face as she walked to the temple in the morning. She remembered the sound of her fellow priestesses singing hymns, their voices rising in harmony. She remembered the simple pleasure of conversation, of laughter, of companionship without fear. She remembered what it felt like to be seen as a person rather than a monster, to be valued for something other than the threat she posed. Sometimes, in the darkest hours, she would try to recall her own face from before the transformation. But memory is imperfect, and time had blurred the details. She could remember being beautiful, but she could no longer quite picture what that beauty had looked like. Her own humanity was fading, replaced bit by bit by the monster she had been forced to become. The heroes came regularly, drawn by fame and the promise of glory. They came with bronze swords and polished shields, with courage, real or feigned, and a desire to prove themselves. They came because killing a Gorgon was the kind of feat that songs were made about, that would secure their place in legend, that would make their names immortal. Medusa killed them all. What choice did she have? They came to murder her after all. The fact that she was monstrous didn't change the basic reality that she was defending her own life. She didn't lure them to their deaths or hunt them down. They came to her, seeking her out in her exile, determined to take her head as a trophy. And when they looked upon her, when they met her cursed gaze, they became stone, their expressions frozen forever in that final moment of horror and realization. With each hero she killed, Medusa's reputation grew darker. The stories spread. The Gorgon Medusa, whose very glance brought death, whose cave was filled with the petrified remains of Greece's finest warriors. She became the monster in cautionary tales, the creature that mothers invoked to scare children into obedience, the ultimate example of the dangers that lurked at the edges of the known world. But no one told the other story. No one spoke of the young priestess who had been violated and then punished for her own violation. No one mentioned the injustice of her transformation, the cruelty of the gods, the fact that every stone statue in her cave represented a person who had come to kill her for the crime of being victimized. In the stories that spread across Greece, Medusa was simply evil, simply monstrous, simply something that needed to be destroyed. Sometimes she wondered what it would be like to die. Her sisters were immortal, truly unkillable, but Medusa retained her mortality despite her monstrous transformation. She could die, could finally escape this cursed existence. But she would not surrender to despair so completely as to end her own life. There was still too much anger in her for that, too much rage at the injustice of her fate. If she was to die, let it be fighting. Let it be defending herself against yet another hero who saw her as nothing more than a stepping stone to glory. She did not know that her death was coming soon, that a hero was already being groomed for the task, that the gods had decided it was finally time for her story to end. She did not know that her death would serve a purpose beyond mere glory-seeking, that her severed head would become a weapon, that even in death she would not be allowed to rest. She knew only the endless days in the cave, the serpents that crowned her head, hissing their constant commentary, the stone faces of the dead staring at her with blank eyes. She knew only that she had been a woman once, had been beautiful and faithful and devoted, and that none of it had mattered in the end. The gods took what they wanted, and when they were done, they discarded the remains. Perseus was the son of Zeus, born of the mortal woman Danae, in circumstances that were themselves the result of divine prophecy and human fear. His grandfather, King Acrisius, had been warned that his daughter's son would kill him, and so had locked Danae in a bronze chamber to prevent her from ever having children. Zeus, of course, found a way. He came to her as a shower of golden light, and Perseus was conceived. Acrisius, discovering his daughter had given birth despite his precautions, could not bring himself to kill her and the child directly. Instead, he sealed them in a wooden chest and cast them into the sea, leaving their fate to the gods and the waves. By chance or divine intervention, they survived, washing up on the shores of an island where they were taken in by a kind fisherman named Dictys. Perseus grew up strong and brave, knowing nothing of his royal heritage or the prophecy that haunted his birth. He lived a simple life as a fisherman's son, until the local king Polydectes decided he wanted Danae for himself. Perseus, now a young man, was protective of his mother and stood in the way of the king's desires. Polydectes needed to remove Perseus, but the young man was popular among the people, and killing him directly would cause problems. So the king devised a scheme. He announced he was going to marry another woman, a lie, and demanded that all his subjects bring him gifts suitable for a wedding. Perseus, having no wealth, boasted that he would bring the king anything he desired, no matter how difficult to obtain. It was a young man's arrogance, the kind of rash promise that countless heroes had made before him. And Polydectes, seizing his opportunity, made his request. "Bring me the head of Medusa, the Gorgon." It was meant to be a death sentence. No one had ever killed a Gorgon before. Those who tried ended up as stone statues decorating Medusa's cave. Polydectes expected Perseus to die in the attempt, clearing the way for him to claim Danae without interference. What the king didn't account for was Perseus's divine parentage and the interest the gods would take in his quest. Athena herself appeared to Perseus, offering her aid. Here was her chance to finish what she had started, to finally destroy the woman she had cursed years before. She gave Perseus her polished bronze shield, instructing him to use it as a mirror so he could approach Medusa without meeting her deadly gaze. She told him where to find the Gorgon's cave and what preparations he would need to make. Hermes, the messenger god, also assisted, providing Perseus with his own curved sword, a blade sharp enough to cut through the Gorgon's neck. Other gods contributed as well. Hades lent him a helm of invisibility, and the nymphs gave him winged sandals to carry him swiftly across the sea. and a special bag to carry Medusa's severed head. Armed with divine weapons and guided by the gods themselves, Perseus set out on his quest. He flew across the Mediterranean, over lands he had never seen, toward the edge of the known world where the Gorgons dwelt. He was brave, certainly, and skilled with weapons. But his success would owe more to the gods' intervention than to his own abilities. He was a tool, a weapon the gods had decided to deploy against a woman who had already suffered too much at their hands. As he flew over the dark waters, did Perseus think about why he was doing this? Did he wonder about Medusa's story, about how she had become a monster? The historical records don't say. The myths present him as a straightforward hero on a straightforward quest. Kill the monster, win the glory, save his mother from an unwanted marriage. The complexity, the tragedy, the injustice, none of that was part of the story as he understood it. He saw only a monster that needed to be slain. He could not see the woman she had been, could not imagine the suffering that had led to her transformation. And perhaps that made it easier. Perhaps that made what he was about to do feel righteous rather than simply brutal. The cave came into view as dawn broke over the eastern horizon. Perseus descended, his winged sandals carrying him silently down to the rocky shore. The statues were everywhere, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, men frozen in their final moments, their expressions a mix of horror, surprise, and fear. They formed a garden of the dead, a monument to the futility of fighting a monster you couldn't even look at. Perseus gripped his curved sword and adjusted Athena's shield, angling it so he could see Medusa's reflection without meeting her eyes. He activated the helm of invisibility, vanishing from sight, and then, with the confidence of a man who knows the gods are on his side, he entered the cave to commit his legendary murder. The cave was darker than Perseus had expected. The early morning light barely penetrated inside. His eyes adjusted slowly, and gradually he began to make out shapes within. More statues, deeper into the cave, where sunlight never reached, their stone faces ghostly in the gloom. The sound of waves echoed off the walls, mixing with another sound, a constant, unsettling hissing that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Medusa was asleep. She and her sisters had stayed awake the previous night, as they often did, and only with the rising sun had they finally settled. Stheno and Euryale were curled together at the back of the cave, their breathing deep and even. Medusa lay slightly apart, as was her habit. Even among her own sisters, she kept her distance, the last remnant of the solitude her curse had forced upon her. Her snake hair moved gently even in sleep, the serpents never fully at rest, their constant motion creating the hissing that filled the cave. In her sleep, her face appeared almost peaceful. The anguish that normally marked her features temporarily softened. For a moment, if one ignored the snakes and her green-scaled skin, one could discern a shadow of the beautiful woman she had once been. Perseus crept closer, invisible in his helm, watching Medusa through the reflection in Athena's shield. He had to be careful. Her sisters were immortal and could protect her if awakened, but they slept deeply, and the gifts of the gods protected him. Everything was in his favor. He prepared carefully, positioning himself and waiting for the right moment. One action, one step, and it would all be decided. The sword Hermes had given him was incredibly sharp, able to overcome any obstacle. He watched the reflection, waiting for the perfect instant. Did Medusa sense him in that final moment? Perhaps some instinct, a remnant of her priestess training, or just the natural awareness of danger stirred her slightly. But whatever it was, she had no way to influence the events that were about to unfold. Perseus acted. In the next moment, it was over. Medusa no longer moved. Her head had been separated from her body, ending her long path of suffering, and her torment was finally at an end. From the end of her life came miracles: Pegasus, the winged horse, and Chrysaor, the mighty warrior with a golden sword, as if born from the very magic of fate. They appeared as reminders of the forces that continue to live on, even when one story reaches its conclusion. Perseus took Medusa's head carefully, the snakes writhing but unable to harm him due to the divine protection he carried. He placed it in the magical bag, designed to contain its power and gaze. Even in death, her presence remained potent, transforming the head into a powerful artifact that Perseus would use later. The sound of the conclusion roused her sisters. Stheno and Euryale rose, their eyes falling on their sister's body. They rushed toward Perseus, but he was already fleeing, his winged sandals carrying him away, the helm of invisibility hiding him from their sight. They called out, but could not reach what they could not see. Perseus returned to Greece, carrying the trophy, the head of the Gorgon. He became a hero, his name destined for immortality, his deed a legend. In the cave at the edge of the world, Stheno and Euryale cradled Medusa's body and wept. They were monsters, yes, but they were also sisters, and they had loved her. They had welcomed her when she was transformed, protected her as best they could, and given her the companionship they could offer. And now she was gone, her journey complete, leaving behind only her memory and the power that would live on. Medusa's body gradually cooled. The snakes in her hair settled, and her eyes, which had held immense power, were placed in the magical bag as a trophy, destined to be used as a tool by others. She had never wanted any of this. She had only wished to serve her goddess and live in peace. But the gods had decided otherwise, and so her story became a tragedy, remembered as the legend of the Gorgon, a being who had never truly been evil, yet would forever be called one. Perseus returned to his home a hero, exactly as he had hoped. He wielded Medusa's head like the weapon it had become, turning his enemies to stone, saving his mother from the unwanted attentions of King Polydectes by petrifying the king and his supporters mid-feast. Later, he would use the head to rescue Andromeda from a sea creature, turning the monster to stone and winning the princess as his bride. The head served him well, this relic of a fallen woman, this proof of his triumph. Eventually, Perseus gave the head to Athena, returning it to the goddess who had guided him in his quest. Athena placed it upon her shield, the Aegis, where it remained forever after, a symbol of protection, a weapon, and a warning. The face of the woman she had cursed became the emblem of her divine power, worn with pride. The story of Perseus and Medusa spread across the Greek world and beyond. It became one of the great hero tales, retold endlessly with variations but always with the same core narrative. A brave hero slays a terrible monster, overcomes impossible odds, and earns glory and reward. Medusa became the archetypal monster, her name synonymous with petrifying terror, her image used to ward off evil and frighten the wicked. Temples and buildings were decorated with her likeness. The Gorgonean, a stylized face with snakes for hair and an expression of fury or dread. Artists painted her on vases and carved her in stone. She appeared on shields and armor, said to bring protection in battle. Her image was everywhere, but her story, her real story, was forgotten. No one spoke of the priestess who had been wronged. No one remembered the mortal who was punished for something beyond her control. No one questioned why a god faced no consequence for his actions, while the woman was transformed into a monster. The tale was simpler, without such questions. The monster is dangerous. The hero defeats it, and the world celebrates. But history has a way of uncovering forgotten truths. Over the centuries, a few voices began to challenge the traditional version. The Roman poet Ovid, in his Metamorphoses, was among the first to tell a different story, that Medusa had once been beautiful, that she had been harmed in Neptune's temple, and that her transformation was a response, not to guilt, but to tragedy. Ovid's version changed everything. It made Medusa sympathetic, a victim rather than a villain. It asked difficult questions about divine justice, blame, and the way mortals, especially women, were treated by gods. Yet even Ovid's more compassionate retelling ended the same way. Perseus struck her down, and the crowd rejoiced. Across the ages, Medusa's image endured, though her meaning shifted. To some, she remained a monster, a warning, a symbol of danger. But to others, she became something far more powerful, a figure of transformation, of fury turned into strength, of a woman who had been wronged but who refused to be silenced. Modern thinkers and artists reclaimed her image, seeing not horror, but resilience. They viewed the serpents as a crown rather than a curse, her gaze as strength rather than menace. They asked the questions ancient storytellers ignored. What if Medusa was never the villain? What if her story was not one of heroism, but of injustice? Some modern interpretations even see Athena's transformation not as a punishment, but as protection, a divine act meant to ensure no one could harm Medusa again. Perhaps it's too generous a reading, yet it speaks to a human need to find meaning in pain, to turn suffering into power, and to reclaim stories that were long told by others. The truth, as always, is complex. Medusa was a woman who was betrayed by the gods she served, cursed by the goddess she worshipped, and slain by a hero who never asked whether his quest was righteous. She was not evil, but her story was written to make her seem so. In the ruins of ancient temples, archaeologists still find images of Medusa. She stares out from pottery and carved stone, her snake-crowned head frozen in artistic representations that span thousands of years. Museum visitors pause before these images, often without knowing the full story, seeing only the surface. A monster, a myth, an ancient legend. But some see more. Some see the face of a woman who was never allowed to be just a woman, whose beauty became a curse, whose faith offered no protection, whose transformation from victim to monster said more about the world she lived in than about her own nature. They see a story that has repeated itself throughout history in countless variations. Women blamed for men's violence, women punished for being victimized, women transformed into monsters by a society that needed them to be something other than human. There is no grave for Medusa, no monument beyond the images that were meant to frighten rather than honor. Her headless body presumably still lies in that cave at the edge of the world, if it ever existed at all. Her head, in the myth, was mounted on Athena's shield, a trophy and a weapon, denied even the dignity of burial. But in another sense, Medusa never died. She lives on in every retelling of her story, in every artistic interpretation, in every person who looks at her image and sees not a monster, but a mirror, reflecting the injustices that persist, the victim blaming that continues, the ways that society still transforms women's trauma into their own fault. The myth of Medusa is not really about a monster. It's about what we turn victims into when their suffering makes us uncomfortable, when their trauma challenges our need. Thank you for watching this video until the end. If you enjoyed it, please support the channel. Give it a like and subscribe so you don't miss new videos.